G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. And here's a dangerous idea for you. Do we need political parties? Do they serve our interests? Is it better to work inside the political system or to blow it all up and try to find a way to empower and to fund independents who can indeed topple governments? Today's guest was fundamental in the last change of government in Australia. His name, the Holmes Court name, is well known in Australia because his father was the first ever billionaire. They come from generation after generation of extremely influential and powerful, wealthy figures, not just here, but back in the UK before Australia was even settled or invaded, as the case may be, by Europeans. And Simon Holmes Court, he's a brilliant guy in his own right, has an extraordinary tale to tell about his relationship with his billionaire father and the consequences of his father's untimely death. And what Simon did at the last election was not single-handedly. He's very bashful about it, and he's very bashful about his financial role as well as his motivational and cultural role in creating the landslide that happened in Australia at the last federal election. So with all of that being said and all of that throat clearing aside, he's basically the most important figure in Australia in creating a wave of centre-right, independent, mostly female candidates who swept aside the Conservative governing coalition after almost a decade in power by targeting them on a few vulnerable issues. Climate change, where voters felt there was inaction. Women's rights, where voters felt there was a kind of a tin-eared deafness towards the need to get real about sexism and indeed even sexual assault and harassment in Parliament House. And corruption. Not so much the old-fashioned corruption of bribing politicians to do your bidding, but just the slightly sleazy everyday corruption that we've gotten used to. Australia did not have a federal anti-corruption body to oversee that everything was clean. These candidates, who were loosely called the teal candidates because they all shared the colour teal on their palette, became a monumental, phenomenal force in Australian politics. They now sit in Australian Parliament, and they were largely responsible for the sweeping aside of a decades-old Conservative rule and the introduction of Australia's Labor government. But Simon's beef is bigger. It's really not just about the short-term tactics of getting rid of any one government or other. It's about the long-term strategy of wresting power away from institutions, political parties that seem deaf to the needs of voters and seem obsessed with their own factional infighting and their own special interests, and putting power back in the hands of the people, back in the hands of independents, back in the hands of members of the community, business people who might want to run for office. Simon's a totally fascinating person. I hope you enjoy this insightful conversation as much as I did with the one, the only, Simon Holmes Court. Yeah, that's a whole other story. Anyway, let's talk about you, Simon. We're going to talk about the public broadcaster.
Trying to distract you.
You were just trying to filibuster about my career. I'm interested. So you started out working for Netscape. You went to the States after. Well,
yeah,
it wasn't your first job, but it was maybe your first big one.
I started studying in Perth at UWA, and I got really involved in student organisation there, sort of student politics without the politics. A large student organisation called ISEC, and I got involved.
Student politics without the politics. What even is that? Because my recollection of
drinking.
My recollection of student politics was that it was incredibly ideological and hostile and fiery and Marxist.
Yeah, there was a sort of parallel. There was this international, it still exists, organisation called ISEC. It's in 80 countries around the world, or it was then. It's probably more now. That specialised in exchanges of student exchanges, internship exchanges, conferences with a lot of sort of professional development along the way, and
a lot of drinking.
And a lot of drinking. So I got really involved in that became the state manager.
The drinking or the conferences? Sorry, I'll leave the drinking behind. Okay, tell me all about it.
We won, the University of Western Australia. We won the national boat race competition more than a few times. So,
what's a boat race competition?
When you get the group of people sculling beers one after the other.
Oh, fabulous!
In a chain. So did reasonably well at that. So I got really involved in that, and I didn't finish my undergraduate degree at University of Western Australia. Did that for about 3 years, worked in Malaysia for a year, and towards the end of that...
Was that for your dad?
My dad had passed away by then, but it was for my family company, an engineering company.
When did he die? How old were you?
I was 18. He died in 1990.
Oof.
So first year uni. Yeah.
Was that unexpected?
Absolutely.
Right.
That was probably a significant role in me moving away from my studies and getting distracted. And I had a business on the side.
And was he still, just for people who don't know, he was Australia's first billionaire. He was a titan of Australian business. Was he still at the top of his game when he died? It irritates me a bit.
No, he, very much. He got smashed by the stock market crash of '87, but put businesses back together. Had recovered from that, but his health wasn't as good as he let on. It wasn't as good as we thought it was, and he had a massive heart attack in September 1990.
Oh shit!
Yeah, so that was a big thing. I worked for ISEC for about 3 years.
But just pause on that for a moment. So you're at uni in first year.
Yeah.
Your dad's a very famous guy, suddenly dies.
It's pretty surreal.
Yeah. What was that? What were the weeks and months after that like?
A bit of a blur. No, very much a blur, because it's there's a sort of a private or family grieving aspect, but there were many people in his life and a very complex business left behind. It was a complex time.
And had there ever been an assumption that it was a family business where there'd be an heir?
I don't think so. No, it was
there was no succession. There was no HBO succession playing out.
No. It's funny. It's funny to watch. I've only actually very recently started watching Succession. It's funny to watch that, to think of, I can sort of see how that could come about. Really, really grateful that my family avoided that.
Yeah, right. So what happened to his business after he died?
My mother took over.
Right.
Very different style. My father was about identifying businesses that were undervalued, buying them up, and it was an amazing group of assets. It at one point it owned the rights to the Beatles and the Muppets and a bunch of newspapers. There were some resource companies in there. It was steel holdings. There were a lot of disparate businesses in there, including a winery and a beef cattle business.
Wow.
And a construction company, and that's the one I went to work for in Malaysia in '93. My mother ran the company very differently. Rather than acquiring and my father would sort of restructure and then move on to buying, restructuring, selling off parts, and really sort of, how would I say it? Sort of finding the undervalued assets and extracting that value and moving on to the next. My mum was much more into running the businesses, as going concerns, and so she took the basket of assets that, sort of a bit like musical chairs. My dad died, and suddenly what was left when the music stopped? She had to sell a bunch of stuff to stabilize the business and pay off a bunch of debt because the banks were a lot more risk averse without without his genius around.
Yeah.
So she stabilized the business and then ran a number of them, including construction, beef, and wine.
Right.
From there and a few other smaller entities.
And so what was Malaysia like the 90s?
Yeah, I understand it's quite different now. I haven't been back. A lot of people I know who've spent time in Malaysia think of the building of the Petronas Towers, which were the largest building in the world for a little while, as being sort of a marker between old Malaysia and new Malaysia. I spent a year there. I'm going to offend people, but this is Malaysia in the early 90s. The racial tensions were really, really strongly felt then.
Between Indian Malaysians and Chinese Malaysians?
The Malay Malaysians hated the Chinese, and the Chinese Malaysians didn't respect the Malay Malaysians.
Yeah.
And both had no respect for the Indian Malaysians. And then the sort of white expats had this strange life of being very, very temporary citizens, a necessary evil for the development of the country, but it was very clear that we didn't belong. We didn't belong there.
And was Mahathir in power at this time?
Yeah, he was. I remember.
For people who don't know, he was a long-serving, sort of slightly cantankerous pro-development.
Yeah, and I remember one thing quite explicitly. It was Paul Keating was our prime minister at the time.
I was at uni, I think, when this happened.
And Keating called him recalcitrant.
That's right. I was going to say intransigent, but yeah, recalcitrant, because he didn't come to the Asia Pacific Economic
Was that what it was?
Forum.
Yeah.
I think he didn't come to one of these events, and it was a huge diplomatic blow-up.
Yeah, we all got a call to come to the Australian Embassy for an emergency meeting that the Malaysian government had were very concerned about this word. Recalcitrant, and they had their best translators working on this
It's a difficult word to translate. It's full of nuance.
And then we came back a couple of days later because Keating had said that he regretted the comment. He used the word regret.
Right.
And they got the best translators again to work out what the word regret really means. And they decided—
Not quite sorry.
They decided that regret was in the way we use it, regret was equivalent to sorry.
Oh, good.
So as the Australians were told, don't worry, you're safe now because the Malaysians have forgiven you. Because
I remember wondering whether or not that whole thing was just a mistranslation problem, because half of Australia wouldn't know what recalcitrant means, and when you translate it into another, it's possible that they translated it as idiotic or something. But anyway, so yes, Malaysia in the 90s. I mean, it's a funny part of Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
Malaysia. I've been there a few times and it's changed a lot.
Yeah, the first week I was there, I remember there was an incident where everyone in the office was standing by a window looking at the river below, and a body was floating down the river. And I remember the person in the office with the lowest station of all, the tea lady, coming across to the window, looking out the window, and went, "Oh, it's only an Indian," and walked off.
Wow.
And that was the racial tensions there were quite mind blowing. There were and lots of institutionalized too, where Malays would have access to cheaper housing, or there would be quotas for university.
Yeah.
Every company had to have a Malay director. So we had one guy who just came into an office a day a month, and we paid him a lot of money, and he didn't do anything for the company, but it was just part of Dr. M was very fixed on elevating the station of Malaysia.
Dr. M meaning Mahathir Mohamad, the president, Prime Minister. It's interesting you say that because you're reminding me that during the lead up to the voice referendum in Australia last year, which would have seen the creation of an Indigenous body, an advisory body to the Australian Parliament, comprising First Nations Australians, I actually got an email when I still had my ABC show from a Malaysian Australian listener saying, trust me, you don't want to import you don't want to encode racial dominance into any facet of your political system, because I've seen what happens in Malaysia, where you have allocations for certain types of people, and the Malays were here first, so the Malays get this quota, and this person was found the designation of First Nations people as being given this place of primacy in the Australian Constitution as like reminiscent of that and problematic.
Well, certainly problematic there, and the Malays weren't the first either. There's an Indigenous group,
of course,
the Orang Putra there, who are completely sidelined.
Right. Right.
So
how far back do you want to go? I mean,
well, that's
Israel, Gaza. Anyone you want to take that on? Do we start the clock in 1948 or 5,000 years ago? So anyway, so you end up and you go on to study cognitive science and computer science and stuff in the States. And
so the work I was doing in Malaysia, I was helping the construction company with it was John Holland Constructions with basically modernizing. Setting up email for the first time between offices.
Wow.
Doing a lot of IT work, and I realized at the end of that stint that, well, for me, IT was about getting people's printers working and teaching them how to use fonts in Word. And I swore to myself I was not going to do anything with computers ever again. I'd been a big computer geek from long way back. I'd been playing with computers since I was about 8 or so, and online from about 11 years old. So I was very much a computer geek, but I realized that when it came to business, computers it was just an awful career. Is where I left. When I left the industry, while I was in Malaysia, I applied for a university called Dartmouth College in the US. I didn't know much about it.
A university called Dartmouth. Isn't it an Ivy League?
It is, yeah. I didn't know what Ivy League meant at that point. I didn't know much about it, but I've got 2 brothers who went to college, and college and university mean the same thing in the US.
Yeah,
they went to college in the US and said, "Yeah, you should apply for Dartmouth. It's pretty good." And without having ever seen it, without having thought much about it, I was offered a spot and I took it.
Right. How does that work? I mean, does the fact that you're the son of a billionaire help?
Look, I think I remember seeing the application brochure. It said, "We have students from 69 countries," and then the next year, when I'd been there, once I'd accepted, it said, "We have students from 70 countries." So,
first Australian.
I think that was part of it. I'd had good results from school.
You were academically good.
And
you went to a very illustrious private school in Australia, Geelong.
I wouldn't say a great school, but I would say I went to an illustrious school.
It's a school for the upper crust.
Yeah. You could do a whole episode on that.
Well, why don't we just touch that since there seems to be something there in your eyes that I can detect about Geelong Grammar. When you say it wasn't a great school, why?
So the school had a pretty dark period, and that's been covered. I mean, it was touched on in recent Four Corners report.
Just explain that for people who didn't see it.
Well, the school had a very significant problem with abuse through the. Well, I was there in the 80s, but it predates that and postdates that. But it was subject of a lot of complaints through the Royal Commission into sexual abuse of children in care. It's a boarding school, and it had a very significant problem with pedophilia in 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s.
Did you see any of that?
I was lucky not to be the subject of any of it, but certainly we all saw inappropriate relationships, and through the Royal Commission, read lots of the evidence for that, and I went along to one of the days of the of the hearings, and people I knew were the subject of were complainants, and teachers who had played a significant role in my education were implicated and charged and served time.
Wow.
Yeah.
Were you aware at the time that it was wrong? Like,
yes.
how old?
Yeah.
were you?
No, we were. Well, I was secondary school, so sort of age 12 to 17. But yeah, no, we were very, very aware it was wrong. But it was a funny environment. The teacher who I think has been most punished out of who served time and was subject of many complaints was my maths tutor, and for the last 2 years of school, I went round to his house every Tuesday night, and he poured me a glass of wine. Luckily for me, I was never, I never felt threatened. I never, never a move on me. But this guy was convicted.
Yeah.
And a lot of I know someone who went through that Royal Commission and said that there were 35 teachers or teachers or staff who were named from Geelong Grammar in that process. So it had a real problem there. That was part of it. I mean, it didn't affect me, but I know it affected a number of people very, very much. But that was in a context where it was a very violent school at that time. My understanding is that it's very, very different now, and I wouldn't want I wouldn't want people to think that I'm saying don't send your kids there because it's awful. I'm sure
it's 40 years later.
40 years later, and it's we're in a different legal context. It's funny. I think now that if a kid at Geelong Grammar had called the Herald Sun today and said, "Hey, I wrote a little a chapter on it in a little book that I published a couple of years ago." A friend of mine was forced down a drain, a stormwater drain, and 6 boys stood on top and urinated on him, and then stood on the grate on top so that he couldn't get out. So he's standing in the dark, in the cold, soaked in the urine of 6 boys on top as they laughed, right? And there were he reported that incident, and nothing happened. In today's environment, if you called up the Herald Sun from Geelong Grammar and said, "Hey, this just happened to me," it'd be front page the next day, right? We're in a different context, whereas then people acted with complete impunity. In fact, the headmaster who oversaw that, who was aware of that incident and many like it, who had documented evidence of all of this, went on to be the head of Eton and was tutor of Harry and William at Eton.
It's extraordinary,
and never suffered anything from that.
It's like the church. It's like the church. It's like so you just take the problematic person and you move them to another jurisdiction where their reputation isn't going to follow them.
So it was a brutal place. It was more about the violence, not really the physical violence, but the psychological violence of that school. That
between the kids or from the teachers?
No, mainly between the kids, but it was understood and accepted, and almost I think it was deemed part of the experience by. You often think that there are 70 kids, 70 young men who are in a boarding house together, with maybe one staff member who sticks around to 10 o'clock at night. The rest of the time, it's Lord of the Flies the whole time, without the stratification of the structure, the social structure that builds based on fear and threat of violence. it would be a much more disorganized place. I think.
Right.
I think that the Lord of the Flies structure that emerges out of that was a useful way of maintaining some level of order.
I mean, it's timeless. That's how we've been arranging. It's how mammals have been arranging their societies for millions of years, right? It's
and you could
you're not
zoom
going to
out
have
to
disorder.
any macro level, and,
exactly.
and the same.
Yeah, the tough are going to be tough, and the weak are going to get preyed on. I mean, it's just insane that anyone ever thought it was a good idea to take the most irrational and power-hungry and hormonal demographic of humanity, which is teenage males, and put them in an anarchic situation like that and let them sort it out for themselves, and that everything would be hunky-dory.
Yeah.
So just before we leave that, I don't want to dwell on this for too long, but so you had friends who you knew at the time were having relationships with teachers?
Certainly, close acquaintances in my year group knew that they were having I wouldn't call them relationships, that they were being pursued,
right?
And that some of that came out in the Royal Commission.
I mean, the reason I say use the word relationships is because it's sometimes interesting in these scenarios where the child will not realize that there's anything wrong with it because it lands for the child as love, care, affection, attention or something. And that's what can be so predatory about it in a way. You've got someone who is incapable of consent, who doesn't have the maturity to process what they're going through. And someone in a position of power abuses that power. And it doesn't, it's not, we have this idea about pedophilia as being this brutalizing sort of rapey act, but often it's more insidious than that, and that's why I say
I think there's definitely something to that. It's and it's a strange environment. It's the school's at the end of a peninsula, tucked away in sort of no man's land, not far from Geelong. It's not actually in Geelong. It's in Corio, sort of separated from the rest of the world by the biggest oil refinery in this part of the world, and it's a cold, physically, emotionally cold place. With you at that stage, you're only allowed to see your parents for you could have one overnight exit at a term, and you could apply to have 2-day exits, but most people wouldn't have any contact with their family for months at a time.
Did you talk to your mum and dad about your concerns about the place?
Certainly did about the physical violence and about the bullying culture there. And it was, the response. I remember the response from parents. Well, if you don't like it, we can take you out and put you somewhere else. But part of the culture of the school was anyone who left was, they can't hack it.
Right.
They were the weak kid who couldn't hack it, couldn't find their place, or they were too weak. And so there was very significant pressure to grind through it. It's been fascinating going to school reunions since, and it feels a bit like group therapy. Very few of us have sent our kids there, and everyone is sort of, by now, almost everyone has made peace with it. So it's not something I think about daily or
But just lastly, I'm
obsess
just
about,
still interested in the dynamic between you and the friends of yours or the friends of friends who you knew this was happening to. I just tell me how you get your head around that when you're 15 and you like.
Yeah, do
you have pity for them? Is it something you just don't talk about? Do you ever talk about it?
No, I haven't talked about it.
I mean, at the time, did one talk about it?
No, it's just rumors and innuendo.
Right.
It's funny. Funny's not the right word, but I went along to a day of the Royal Commission where I saw 3 headmasters get up in the stand, and none of them said in as many words. But what the subtext was, things were different back then, and it was shocking to hear and outrageous, but there is some, I wouldn't say some truth to it. I mean, it is as abhorrent then as it is now. But as I said before, you can call if something like that happened to you now and you called the Herald Sun, front page next day, Royal Commission, places shut down. If you called up back then, if you called up some of the media, they say, boys will be boys, or, important growing, character building. We societal standards have moved a lot in that time. Lots of innuendo, and that was, and some of that too was bullying by the school community of some of the weaker teachers. If a teacher was effeminate, then they were it was automatically assumed that they were a predator. And,
right.
It turned out some were, some were not. They were just unusual.
Yeah, right. Okay, so you survived Geelong, you survived Malaysia, you survived Dartmouth.
Dartmouth was wonderful, but it was quite odd in that. So I was by the time I went, I was 22. In the US, the drinking age is 21. My peers were 17 and 18. So I was a mature age student, 22.
Wow, yeah, right, of course.
And I'd long ago worked out, how to manage life around alcohol and have that as, whereas here was a haven where these kids were away from home for the first time.
Well, when you were talking about Geelong, it reminded me a bit of an American college fraternity with its hazing rituals and the people who've just come into it with,
Dartmouth
the first time they've ever left mummy and daddy's house.
Dartmouth has a very strong, what they call Greek system, right? It's so weird to have it called the Greek system.
I know. I've asked Americans why it's called the Greek system, and no one can tell me except that
just the Greek letters.
Yeah, I know, but they think that it was inherited from the ancient Greeks or something. Most of the people who I ask say, "Isn't it from Greece?" No, it's not from Greece.
Just the letters.
It's just American.
Yeah. So I saw my peers going through that. The process to get into the fraternity, where you pledge and then you go through a hazing period, and then you come out the other end, and you are then entitled to run the whole process from the other end the next year against the next lot of kids. And I just had zero interest in joining a drinking club. I'd been part of them before, or going through any hazing rituals, especially with people who were 4 or 5 years younger than me, who were just, tasting freedom for the first time when I felt a lot more mature. But the friends I made there and the quality of the education was phenomenal.
And so how does Netscape happen?
So I promised myself I wouldn't do anything to do with computers, because computers were just getting people's printers working.
Yeah.
But
this is now the late 90s, right? So everything's blowing up. The internet is...
Yeah, so I got really interested in, there was a relatively new subject there, I think it was the second year to do it, or a new major called cognitive science, and it was a mix of psychology, linguistics, philosophy, and artificial intelligence. It was, these days we'd probably call it digital humanities with an AI specialization.
I think cognitive science still exists as a degree.
Probably does. It's... people don't advertise for cognitive scientists.
No, sure.
And I really was intrigued by the AI side, and you had to do a bunch of computer science to get there. And I was surprised with how much I really enjoyed that pathway.
What intrigued you about the AI side?
The thing I found most interesting about AI at that point was that everything, any complex behavior by a computer was that a computer couldn't do was intelligence, until we worked out how to solve it. Like, it was at that. I was at university there when computers started beating the best chess players in the world, and we had to sort of grapple with, is the computer intelligent, or is it just a better algorithm than we've had before? And we always went down the path of, no, it's not intelligence, we're just getting better at working out how the game works. One of the very first things you do in an AI course is you program noughts and crosses, where you can make a very easily, as anyone who's played the game more than a few times know, if you don't stuff up, you'll at least, the worst you do is a tie. and you can make a computer that is that will never lose and always win against a weak player. And you can do that in your first term of doing any AI. And you go, okay, is this intelligent? No, it's just an algorithm. It's just a very simple algorithm. So I found it interesting, the philosophical side of what is AI, what is intelligence, and what is just it's just an algorithm.
Yeah, and now that you've fast forwarded a quarter of a century ahead and seen what AI can do now, how do you feel when you see ChatGPT about that question?
Let me just go back a little bit. I remember a day in February '94 when I was in the office in Malaysia, and I'd been trying for 3 months to get the computer onto get my computer onto this thing. They call it jarring, which was Malay for net. So getting computer onto the net, and you had to go download Mac TCP from something, and you had to, and get permission from the university chancellors to connect to the net. After months of work, I finally got the computer onto the internet, and I downloaded Mosaic, which was the first browser that came out of University of Illinois. So I downloaded that, and I remember being in the office. It was sort of 6 p.m. at night. Everyone had gone home, and I was busting to go to the toilet, but I'd got the web browser up for the first time, and it absolutely blew my mind. I'd been playing around on bulletin boards for a decade before then, more than a decade. But the penny dropped of how significant this internet thing's going to be.
And this is probably still with a dial-up modem.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the pages are loading text like just one line at a time.
Yeah. The images would come in progressively, right? They'd start blurry.
The pixels would just slowly load.
Yeah. So, I remember that distinctly. And then again in November 22, when I first saw ChatGPT, I had the same experience without the going to the toilet bit, where I just thought, holy crap, everything's changed. And I'd done this AI major, and the professor I studied under most for that is now the head of AI at MIT.
Wow.
And in her class, we all came to the conclusion, I think everyone, that AI would not happen in any interesting form in our lifetime. And when I stumbled across ChatGPT one night in November 22, it was just holy crap. This is an inflection point where it's the beginning of an era where nothing will be the same again.
It's funny, isn't it, seeing the wave build in some ways. Yes, you've seen ChatGPT, but it hasn't yet impacted. I mean, it's going to change everything. Yep. I feel actually a little bit like I did in February of 2020 when COVID was coming.
Right.
And
don't know where this is going.
I knew enough people in epidemiology to know that something absolutely world-changing was happening, and everybody was walking around as if life was normal, and I was a Chicken Little. And in a strange way, when everything fell apart and the lockdowns came, and all of a sudden everyone was running around scared, and I was kind of relieved because I felt like I'm less of a crazy person. I've been saying the train's coming. Now we're all on the train. We're all together. we're going to go on this journey, and we'll survive it.
Who knows where it's going?
Yeah, and in some ways I feel like that about AI. I know that this is going to be completely world-changing. Nobody else quite sees it yet. We talk a lot about it, job losses or misinformation or this or that. It's going to be so much bigger than that.
Yep.
And now I'm just like, okay, let's wait and see. Let's wait and see what the train looks like. At some point in the next 18 months or 2 years,
incredible rate.
3 years, there's going to be a moment where we're going to go, we're not going to recognize the world that.
Well, I'm still amused that after several years of study and some of the best minds, and we went and visited MIT while we were there, and we met with Marvin Minsky, who was one of the leaders in AI thinking. We all left that major with the idea that it's not going to happen in our lifetime. And expectations have just been.
And so,
been
just
shattered.
on that question of intelligence, though, that you were alluding to earlier about, like, what intrigued you about AI when you were at university was this question of, is the noughts and crosses machine just doing algorithms, or is there some intelligence there?
Yeah.
Has your thinking on that? What was your thinking then, and has your thinking evolved now that you've seen what ChatGPT can do? What is intelligence?
Okay, the evolution in my thinking on that is that is not so much that is not are computers becoming intelligent. My thing is more is many of the things that we think that we do that are intelligent are not.
Right.
So I'm thinking actually that we overrate many of the things that we do. Yeah, we think it's brilliant work when we write an article. You write an op-ed. Throw 10 bullet points at ChatGPT and ask it to write an op-ed, and it does better than your average columnist.
That may say something about the quality of our columnists.
But we would have said not long ago, it requires a basic level of intelligence to write a piece. Actually, this shows us that a very significant amount of what we do is not. There's no secret sauce,
right? But the AI is piggybacking on the human intelligence of all of the op-eds that have ever been written.
Yes. Which
is not to say that humans aren't doing that as well.
No, I think we do, right?
Yeah,
we all do. Right? We spend years piggybacking on standing on the shoulders of others. And I think we're coming to a fascinating stage when the AIs that we have now have been trained on 100% human content. Content is now being where we sit right now, 99% of content being created in the world is by AI. We don't see most of it. Most of it's junk, but Google's having a hell of a time filtering out pages that have just been, there are content farms just creating billions of pages have been created recently that we don't see enough, but Google's doing its damnedest to try to filter out. But we're getting to a point where AI is going to be being trained on AI generated content. And I sort of quipped the other day, it's a bit like mad cow disease, right? We're now feeding AI output into AI.
Because mad cow disease was caused by feeding
cows to
cows. They put cow matter into the feed of
ground up cows into the feed of cows. So we're at this interesting point where AI is being trained by humans. Pretty soon, AI is going to be trained by, when you find some content, it's basically impossible to work out whether it was generated by a human or by AI. So pretty soon, AI will be feeding on itself.
Yeah. What happens then?
I don't know.
That's the train.
It's going to be fascinating. Anyway, we could delve into this just for hours. Yeah.
A final point about AI before we get to the other things that interest me about you. There are so many. The ability of AI to write a John Grisham novel is undisputed, or will soon be undisputed, right? It's going to be able to write your op-eds. It's going to be able to write screenplays that are just as good as an Avengers film, right?
Right.
Whether or not an AI can ever write Annie Hall,
right,
or Tchaikovsky, or Proust, or James Joyce, or something, is another question. Like, do you believe that there's a sprinkle of pixie dust in human consciousness that elevates us beyond just the integration of information processing, or are we just so good at information processing that we can sometimes produce a Beethoven?
I mean, so I've gone back and spoken, met with some of the professors I had at that stage, and had fascinating conversations about what changed. Why has there been such a rapid increase recently? And significantly, it comes down to the amount of processing power and the resources, the memory, that these machines have, but also the access to the corpus. When we were working on AI in the late 90s, you'd download a few megabyte file, which would be a language corpus, which would be 57 works of literature that were all put together in a file, and you'd throw it to AI and say, learn something about language from that. The training sets are now literally billions of times larger than that, and the processing speed is billions of times larger than that, and these things are running for months at a time, right? So there's just a step change in resources. I think some of our pixie dust comes down to orders of magnitude more experience. Just every day walking down the street, we are taking in a massive amount of information, and every human interaction we have. I think AI is still orders of magnitude away from having the stimulus and training sets that we have.
But in principle, it could. I'm talking about something truly new, right? So obviously, now that Tolkien has existed, AI is going to be able to write Lord of the Rings books. But prior to Tolkien ever having existed, could AI be Tolkien?
I don't enjoy having this view, but I don't think there's any magic pixie dust. I think we are an amazing computer or amazing computational engine with amazing sensors and actuators, and that eventually, if we replicated something with similar resources, and we're a long way off that, then we will start to see behavior that I just saw OpenAI's Sora demonstration this morning. I don't know if you've come across that. The video
AI.
Yeah. And where we've come in 1 year from what they were doing in AI-generated images a year ago.
They'll be able to generate whole movies on the fly that are tailor-made to what you want, and it'll be able to...
So will it be in the top 1% of creativity? Maybe not for a while. Will it be... So already, I think the AI can do better than a lot of us at mundane things that we used to think required intelligence. Much the same way that we solved. I was speaking to an academic recently who said that they use AI for recommendation letters.
Interesting.
They said, you put in 5 bullet points of what the student did, you throw it in AI, and it spits back, what used to take you half an hour to do, right? It will spit out something that is completely respectable, useful, that both the university administrator and the student are both happy with.
Yeah.
Now, just like I had that flash of, oh my God, a computer can do tic-tac-toe.
Yeah.
It's just an algorithm. We've come to that point with AI. I want to believe there's something special in humanity.
But you don't really buy it. In which case, AI will exceed our creativity, our discoveries, our understanding. I mean, it has to. If it can get to us, then there's no reason why it doesn't. And
if we give it the resources,
yes,
right.
Yeah.
Which
by the time it's that smart, it may figure out how to get its own resources. Right. I mean, it's embedded in the internet. It has control over.
Yeah,
our
it's
power
funny.
plants.
I saw someone sent me a link to a robotics startup that's working on humanoid robots, and it talks in the. Our next challenge is to make sure that we have the robots are able to make the next generation of robots. And it's like,
haven't you seen this movie?
Yeah, exactly.
I've seen
seen this movie before. It's like, can we please just have humans as the decider of whether.
I mean, it's too late. We're already generating these things in beta online. I mean, I always thought that AI was going to be built in a lab, highly secure, the way that, like the Manhattan Project.
Yeah.
And then there'd be a conversation about how to release it, and the worry would be maybe it'll bribe one of the officials who work there to release it.
No, we're shoveling the resource.
We're pushing it out there. It's embedded in everything. I mean, it's got access to everything apart from.
Yeah, I was talking to someone who's working with data centers on the periphery of the data center industry in the US, and 10 years ago, a 2 or 10 megawatt demand for a data center, that's just a big number, was a big thing. And in the last 5 years or so, 200 megawatts is what the big Facebook, Amazon
up from what? Sorry,
from 2 to 200.
Yeah, in the past few years.
And they're now there's a data center company in the US that apparently is building 2 data centers that are a gigawatt each, and they're motivated. So it's 1,000 megawatts. So 500 times bigger than they were a decade ago.
Yeah, right.
And the energy demand is coming from AI. It's massively more energy hungry. And people are talking very seriously that we're going to have to build power stations next to these data centers. They were hard to swallow science fiction films 20 years ago, where there were these AIs with nuclear reactors at the core of them, and the hero would go in and turn off the nuclear reactor, and the whole AI would power down and humanity would be free. We are. I just think it's not that we're not even thinking. How do we work carefully with this? We're scaling up. We are throwing. If the AI had, I'm not at all saying it has a sentience, but it's almost like saying humans give me what I need, and we're saying yes, sir.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's talk about power then, and electricity and energy.
Yep.
This is obviously something that motivates you enormously. Where did your concern and activism come from?
Well, first, I moved back from the US in 2001.
Was that before or after 9/11?
I missed 9/11.
Get out.
I left the US on September 10th and arrived on September 12th.
You're lucky you were able to land. Was it just, I guess it was happening, was it, while you were landing?
Yeah. An hour out of Sydney, the pilot came onto the cabin intercom and said, while you're in flight, terrorist threats were received against US aviation. Our intelligence is that we were never in threat. More information will be available on your arrival. And we thought, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
Terrorism wasn't even something we thought about at that point. We landed, and I remember there was a form letter that United Airlines had that was all blank except for the flight numbers. So it was something that they prepare in event of a crash while you're flying. And they had to squeeze three, two. Well, it was 2 United flights.
Oh, yeah. I see.
They put in the call signs and had to squeeze them into the box, and the media swamped our plane, and we had no idea why we were of interest.
Right. And just in terms of the timing, so that listeners who aren't in Australia are aware, it happened very late at night on the 11th in Australian time, which means that it would have been while you were in flight. You would have landed at 6 a.m. or something, probably, and it was all just still underway. George W. Bush would have been flying in an undisclosed location and all that sort of stuff.
All the monitors
apart from the fact that the towers had come down.
Yeah, and most of the monitors in the airport were switched onto the news, and we had no idea. No one was sure at that stage whether it was 2 buildings or 20, and there were all sorts of rumors. It was complete fog of information fog. I remember distinctly there was the woman checking our bags from Sydney down to Melbourne was crying, and we said, "It's pretty awful." And she said, she was crying because it was the last day Ansett was flying.
Oh my goodness! A domestic airline in Australia that went bust.
Yep.
Wow. That's revealing of her priorities, I suppose. Yeah.
Well, it was I think a traumatic. It was anyway bizarre.
It was a
So yeah,
crazy time for
so
everybody.
we left the US, wondering if it was a very tough decision to move back to Australia. We thought, are we doing the right thing? Hopped on this plane, and then arrived, going, thank goodness it's a.
Who's the we at
my
the
wife and I.
stage?
So,
you were already married?
Already married. We had Katrina and I had a 1-year-old. And
where did you meet Katrina?
Actually met her at Geelong Grammar at school.
Right.
Yeah. We were friends. Didn't go out for it. Took us about 5 years to get together, and we had a long distance relationship as I bounced around the world and she did too.
Great.
But we got married in 97.
In the States?
No, we actually got married in Greece.
How wonderful!
Yeah. We didn't want to drag our Australian friends to the US, and we didn't want to drag our US friends to Australia. So we thought, well,
neutral territory.
Somewhere
pretty. Lovely. Okay, so you get back to Australia, and then yes, I want to get to present day politics. And
okay, so get back to Australia, and I started working for the family business. They gave me a task. They wanted to do two things. Bring some automation into the business. It was very difficult to get staff to do a particular job, checking the water supplies of the of cattle stations, because everyone with a pulse had been slurped across to the mines in Northern Australia, and it was very, very difficult to staff this particular job of where you just hop in a car and drive between each of the different bore sites and just check that there's water for the cattle.
Right.
You do that. It'd take you 6 days to do the whole to do sort of 3 loops of the property. You have Sunday off and do it again. And they just had a real problem with attracting staff who wanted
there was
to do
a
that
mining
job.
boom at the time, and there was a lot of money in mining, and everybody was
exactly. And agriculture just could not afford to pay people the same.
Right.
So they wanted me to solve, how can we apply some automation with this? And some of the work I'd done, I'd been in. We sort of skipped over Silicon Valley, but I worked sort of in deep tech for nearly 5 years there. And we also had another problem, is that we were burning about 1 million litres of diesel a year, a lot of it for electricity on the stations. And was there a way?
Is that because they were off grid, or they just had such high power demands?
Both. Off grid. Water is a big thing. On one station I did some analysis, worked out it was costing us $18,000 a year just to keep the grass green. And I said that to a manager, and he said, worth every penny. What do you mean? He said, you come in from a day at the yards, and to take your shoes off and walk on green grass.
Oh, that's nice, isn't it?
It was, for the mental health of everyone on the station, he said, worth every penny.
Yeah.
But we were wasting a lot of power, a lot of diesel there are a lot of inefficiencies in the system. So I worked on an energy efficiency project. The first time I'd really worked. I mean, I've been playing with electricity, and I electrocuted myself when I was 2.5. So I sort of I trace back my fascination to then. But did a lot of work on energy efficiency. Did a pretty detailed review of whether solar could help us at that point, and it was marginal. Just back in 2002, it was hard to justify. You'd have to bring in tons of lead acid batteries, and solar panels cost about 15 times as much. Maybe I should rethink those numbers, but probably 30 times as much as they do now. So it really didn't make a lot of sense. And around that time, my wife and I built a house in regional Victoria on a farm, and it was off grid. It was going to cost way too much to bring power lines in, and they would have gone across our view. So we built off grid, and it was pretty early for an off grid system. So I learned a lot about.
And what was the electricity supply off grid there? What, we were using solar or
solar with lead acid batteries.
Yeah. Okay.
It was going to cost $66,000 for a power line, and it cost $50,000 for solar battery with a diesel backup.
Right.
The diesel backup was with that phase probably I don't know, a few hundred hours a year of diesel generator.
Yeah, right.
We upgraded the system a few years ago.
And were you exercised about climate change at this point? What was motivating the solar thing that long ago?
For that, it was just initially it was
just practical.
It was just
and you didn't want a
economic.
diesel generator running 24 hours a day.
Definitely didn't want that. It didn't make sense to do economically to run one.
Right.
And you want the freezer going, even when you're not there.
Yeah,
so made a lot of sense and it was cheaper to have solar than it was to bring power in. So I learned a lot from that. A lot of teething problems in the early stage. The supplier of our system later admitted to me that we were their first off-grid customer.
Wow.
And then he joked that we were also their last off-grid customer. They decided it was just too much hassle.
But get us to the point at which this becomes a tipping point for you and essentially a life calling, and also how you got into politics. When that began.
Probably the most important moment for that whole journey, or the important episode, was I bumped into a lovely but somewhat eccentric Danish builder of straw bale houses in Daylesford, who wanted to build a community wind farm. He'd grown up in Denmark, and at that stage, I think there were 2,300 community-owned wind farms in Denmark, whether it was owned by the local council or farmer cooperative, or one of the first offshore wind farms in the world is in the Bay of Copenhagen, and it's owned by a cooperative of tens of thousands of Copenhagen residents. So he had that vision to bring that model to Victoria, and I was just hooked on the idea as soon as I heard it. He eventually he got a bunch of people together. Project started gaining traction, held a town hall meeting to decide whether or not we're really going to go ahead and do this. And I went in to that meeting thinking I'd be up for being part of it, but I accidentally came out as the chairman of the new organisation. I said, put my hand up, that I was interested, and got on the board. And then the board sort of pointed to me and said, "Well, you should be the inaugural chair." It's like, okay, I've never done this before, but that was a really fun project because it was at the intersection of community, capital raising. We had to raise a bunch of money to build this. It's a 2-turbine wind farm. Quite small now, only 4 megawatts, but it's owned by a cooperative of 2,000 members, and it generates as much power as the town uses.
Wow!
So it's so we had to raise a bunch of money. We had to find people who the contractors to build it and sign all the contracts. There's the planning system you had to go through, but there was a whole media and politics side to it. And because it was a small organization and being the chair, I had to have a part in every, had to get a taste of every part of it. I think there were 35 different contracts to sign to put this project together. And I was a signatory on pretty much all of them. Through that, I met a lot of really amazing local Daylesford residents, but people around the country who are interested in this concept. And it became, it was a fairly significant project of community taking, rather than sitting back and thinking someone ought to fix this, of saying, you know what, we're going to do it ourselves, and they did it, and they're incredibly proud. So a lot of social capital was built in that, and it was at a time we're seeing echoes of this now, a time where wind farms were controversial, but here was a community embracing it. It's a yes in my backyard rather than a not in my backyard.
Yeah, right.
So I got a lot out of that. Got co-opted to join a lot of advocacy trips up to Canberra, which I thought were going to make a difference, and I realised that kind of advocacy of getting a bunch of people together and putting together a report and going and knocking on doors in Canberra and saying, "Hey, we've got this great idea," is not really how change happens.
Change happens by funding independent candidates to run against vulnerable politicians.
Well,
if you plucked off,
certainly that's probably the most impactful thing.
And how did that
I
idea
did.
come about?
I was exposed. One of my favourite thinkers in the public sphere, Professor Lawrence Lessig. He was at Stanford, now at Harvard. He's a fascinating guy if you ever come across him. He invented, or he came up with the Creative Commons concept, which is how we manage public domain licensing for content. Almost every government report and so much content on the internet now is not under a copyright system, but under the Creative Commons system, which you can have this, you can do what you like with these very clear constraints or not, or not, as it might be. So he did it. He revolutionized copyright and public domain sort of in the first decade of the century, and he spent most of the last decade looking at democracy. He's still very active at working out where our democratic system is going wrong. He inspired me very much with there's a quote that he used to start his presentations with. It's a Henry David Thoreau quote that for 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil, there is but one striking at the root, and really encouraging us to, we need people to be hacking at the branches every day, but you need to go to the root problem. And I had been mucking around with advocacy, trying to convince particularly my local member that they're on the wrong.
Who was your local member?
Local member was Josh Frydenberg. He was a backbencher when I first met him, but worked his way up to being the treasurer. But spent a fair bit of time with him trying to get him to understand that his party was getting on the wrong side of history on energy transformation.
And was he receptive to that message personally?
Overall, I'd say not. No, for him, the politics were more important than there was no the politics were the purpose. So I spent a lot of time trying to change minds, and ultimately, and I got for a while there. I was a member of the fundraising organisation that supports the member for Kooyong, but I was ultimately kicked out of that group after making some critical comments on where the coalition, in particular Frydenberg, was going on energy, making some really big missteps, I thought, and
So Frydenberg kicked you out as a fundraiser because you
as part of the
had something
fundraising
to
group.
do with the approval of a.
Oh, there was AGL had announced that it was closing the Liddell Power Station.
That's right,
and the government, Frydenberg was on the phone to the directors of the company, trying to get the CEO sacked, trying to force the company to keep the power station open.
Right.
When actually the power station had been slated for closure by the New South Wales
And you
government.
wrote a piece saying, if it's going to close, let it close. Stop trying
Well,
to
I
keep coal.
wrote a piece saying why it's going to close, why the economics, and why. I wrote a piece talking about how, just a throwaway line in the middle, that for an accomplished tennis player, such a simple unforced error was really silly.
Because Frydenberg was a good tennis player when he was young.
The AGL were never going to say yes. He also picked the wrong guy to try to bully. The CEO of AGL was American. His young kid was back in the US. He didn't have any reverence or fear of political leaders in Australia. He wasn't about to go and jeopardize his career because he was worried about what the Liberal Party thought of him. So he was very happy to dig in on the issue. He was always going to win. So and trying to get him fired was was a really silly path forward.
I mean, was it also silly of Frydenberg in hindsight to antagonize you and boot you out as a fundraiser, since you ended up helping to coordinate his demise, his political demise?
I'll leave that to others to connect the dots. But yeah, suffice to say that I worked for a long time to try to change minds, and then realized that was probably hacking at the branches, and inspired by Lessig, who had similarly he started an organization to support candidates running on a platform of integrity. So I was very much inspired by him. I realized it's much easier to much easier to change the politicians than to change the politicians' minds.
Right. How did you go about doing it?
Well, the community independence movement started long before me, and I'm only a small part of that movement.
You're a lot of its money.
I'm not. Climate 200 was probably, it was less than half the money in the movement, and I'm about 2% of the money.
Sorry, by you I meant Climate 200. Yeah. But yeah.
Well, by now about 13,000 donors behind Climate 200. What I did is Climate 200 is a bit of a play on the organisation that I was kicked out of was Kooyong 200. So it was a play on that. Kooyong 200.
Kooyong is the electorate that that you were living in, that Josh Frydenberg was the member for.
It exists to perpetuate the Liberal member for Kooyong's tenure. Climate 200 exists to help pro-climate independents get into have a
right, but it was not a subtle jibe. It was not.
I'll leave it to you to connect the dots. Yeah, I mean, I look, I wouldn't have thought to do it if what's that thing they say in politics? You want to keep people inside the tent pissing out.
Not outside pissing in.
So, but I in 2018 I accidentally, and it's a longer story, but got involved in the Kids Off Nauru campaign. The government had told us that there were no kids in detention, but at that stage there were nearly 200 kids on Nauru. A significant number of them had been subject to abuse. There were kids as young as 10 attempting suicide, and all the while the government was telling us there were no kids on detention. And a very well-run civil society campaign worked on elevating the issue and it was clever because Australians have a complex relationship with asylum seekers that arrive by boat. And we're disappointingly all over the map and on that, and disappointingly a large proportion of people are really worked up about that. But almost no one thinks that kids deserve to be in detention just because their parents, for however their parents arrived in the country. So that was a very effective campaign, and the independents in Parliament at the time, who had the balance of power, it's funny, that whole Nemesis series came and went, and it was never mentioned in that for the first 6 months of Morrison's tenure as Prime Minister, it was a minority government.
Right, of course.
And the independents had a massive win with first getting the kids off Nauru, and then with the Medivac legislation that helped medically vulnerable detainees offshore get access to medical care.
Yeah, bring them to the mainland.
So I worked, So in that I had a lot of exposure to independents, particularly Karen Phelps, and I saw how they were...
Karen was a former head of the Australian Medical Association and a GP who went into politics as an independent.
She when Malcolm Turnbull resigned from the Liberal Party after he was ousted, she contested his seat and won in was it November 2018, she and the rest of the crossbench, both in the House and the Senate, did an amazing job working legislation through the system against the government's wishes. That was probably the only piece of legislation that had any positive human rights impact on refugees in that decade. So all the pieces came together. I had been given. I didn't so much realize that my work to change from within. It wasn't a realization that my change from within wasn't working. It was. I was very forcefully told your change from within is not welcome.
Right.
So I had to be.
Yeah.
I had to have a door at one point literally closed in my face to get that message. So I was stubborn to give up on that change within strategy.
Yep.
But I came across independents who were just a cut above when it came to integrity. And
eventually you were like, well, all right, if you want to fight, then let's have a fight.
My theory of change was you've got a party that is being pushed further and further to the right every day through bad advice in the Murdoch media, and there's no countervailing force pushing them back. And I remember,
but aren't they more to the right now as a result of the independent insurgents?
they're certainly further to the right, and I would say my theory of change that they would respond by, they would respond rationally. I was wrong.
Of course they won't, because you've stripped all of the moderates out of the party.
Yeah, so that's what I want to question. Who were the moderates that left the party? I'd say
Jason Falinsky, Josh Frydenberg, Trent Zimmerman.
Zimmerman, I'll give you as a moderate, and Sharma maybe. Their voting records certainly are not flash. I mean, Zimmerman was on the
Hang on,
committee.
But let's just define what we mean by moderates. When you're voting as a government, you're going to vote along with the government. So your voting record is always going to be whatever the government's is. But what the government does in the secrecy of cabinet room is, I mean, in a party system, that is the way that the party works, right? But the
Liberal Party prides itself on free thinking, right? On
that's
freedom.
a slogan.
Yes.
That's a slogan.
Yes.
But the overall direction of the party or the government is going to be determined by the sort of the reasonableness of the members who are in it, and all the reasonable ones are no longer there.
Well, let me challenge. Frydenberg didn't call himself a moderate. He wasn't part of the moderate faction. He was part of Morrison's faction.
But that was not the hard right faction. They were the
I'm not saying he was part of the hard right faction, but
what's the other faction if not the moderate faction?
Oh, there were three factions in the Liberal Party at that point.
Sounds semantic, but all right.
But
I mean, in the battle between Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg on the one hand, versus the right, they were perceived as the moderate. They were perceived as the less right wing faction. I don't know what they call it internally in the Liberal Party.
I challenge you to give me an identifiable position that Frydenberg took on anything. That a moderate, that would classify him as a moderate. The moderates didn't count him as a moderate. He didn't call himself a moderate. In fact, I find no discernible ideology at all.
Yeah, that's fair. Let's say that being not an ideological right winger is better than being a highly ideological.
Sure.
Right.
So I wouldn't. I think he was.
Agitated.
I think he was.
Leave Fry to the side and just talk about the fact that the dynamic that happens when you, almost by definition, one's ability to get independents to win in conservative seats depends on the running in conservative seats where the voters are going to be most amenable to not voting for a conservative. Therefore, you're going to take out the candidates, the members of parliament, who are if you don't want to call them moderate, then you can at least call their voters moderate, because they're the electorates where by definition an independent could win. In a hard right seat where voters are super, super right wing, you couldn't do what you did, because it'd be hard to convince anyone not to vote for.
So what did I do? So that's that. So I
replaced moderate members of parliament with independents. Replace moderate members of the ruling government with independents, and therefore allowed Labor to win.
Well, Labor would have won anyway, wouldn't they?
Maybe.
Labor won enough seats in their own right to govern, so they weren't.
Yeah, in the context of a teal wave.
If the teal wave hadn't happened, Labor still would. Let's say every one of those seats, every one of the.
Maybe I'll grant you that, but either way, the Conservative Party would be more full of.
But I think there's definitely it's a form of survivor bias here. So Climate 200 supported 23 communities at the 2022 election. We didn't start any of the campaigns. We had nothing to do with the selection of any of the candidates. We stood back, and these groups rose up. Now,
what does that mean? How did they rise up?
So this movement started back in really about 2012 up in Indi in northern Victoria.
To hear the rest of this conversation, go to uncomfortableconversations.substack.com/listen, and you will get your own personal premium podcast feed with at least 3 extra episodes of the podcast every month and heaps of extra stuff, including the remainder right now of the fabulous conversation you've just been hearing. If it was worth listening to this much of, don't rob yourself of the rest. Pull out your phone right now and search for Uncomfortable Conversations on Substack.